September 1948, Moscow. Over 50,000 Soviet Jews gathered outside a synagogue to celebrate Israel's first ambassador, and Stalin watched this massive show of support for a Middle Eastern state with growing concern. Here's the strange part. Stalin had helped create Israel by sending weapons, providing diplomatic support, and voting for it at the UN. Yet when it came to Arab countries like Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, Stalin never even tried to build relationships with them. His successors would spend decades pouring weapons and money into the Arab world, but Stalin completely ignored it. Why did the man who controlled half of Europe have zero interest in the Middle East? To understand Stalin's failure, you need to see what he actually cared about. After World War II ended in 1945, Stalin's entire focus was on Eastern Europe. Soviet troops had occupied Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria during the war, and Stalin wasn't letting go. Between 1945 and 1953, he poured resources into controlling these countries, installing communist governments, crushing opposition, and building an empire that stretched from Berlin to Moscow. The scale was massive. The Soviet Union stripped 3,500 factories from occupied territories and stationed advisors in every capital to reshape governments according to Moscow's rules. The challenges Stalin faced in this region were constant and consuming. Poland required brutal force to suppress the Home Army resistance fighters who had fought the Nazis and now fought Soviet occupation. Thousands were arrested, interrogated, and deported to labor camps in Siberia. Hungary needed careful political manipulation because communists were a tiny minority. They had to install a minority government over a population that voted overwhelmingly for democratic parties in the first free elections. Czechoslovakia appeared stable with its coalition government until February 1948, when Stalin authorized a communist coup that eliminated the last functioning democracy in Eastern Europe. The coup shocked Western governments and accelerated the division of Europe into hostile camps. Yugoslavia presented an even bigger problem. In 1948, Marshal Tito refused to take orders from Moscow, creating the first major split in the communist bloc. Stalin spent years trying to isolate Yugoslavia and even considered military action, though he never followed through. The Berlin blockade consumed Stalin's attention from June 1948 to May 1949. Stalin cut off all ground access to West Berlin, trying to starve out the Western powers and force them to abandon the city. The Western response, a massive airlift that delivered thousands of tons of supplies daily, eventually forced Stalin to back down, but the crisis brought the world dangerously close to war. Beyond these headline crises, Stalin dealt with ongoing armed resistance in Ukraine and the Baltic states, where nationalist fighters continued guerrilla warfare into the early 1950s. He faced food shortages and famine inside the Soviet Union that required harsh grain collection policies. He initiated new purges targeting party officials he suspected of disloyalty. With all these problems demanding his attention and resources, the Middle East simply didn't matter enough to Stalin. He had limited energy, limited advisors, and limited money to spend on foreign policy. Eastern Europe was critical because Soviet troops controlled it. China mattered because it had a genuine communist movement that might actually win. The Arab world had neither Soviet military presence nor viable communist parties, making it a low priority that Stalin largely ignored. Meanwhile, the Arab world existed in a completely different reality. Every major Arab country was firmly aligned with the West, and nothing suggested that would change. Egypt was still controlled by Britain in ways that made independence almost meaningless. British troops occupied the country, especially around the Suez Canal, which Britain considered vital for shipping routes to India and Asia. King Farouk's government depended on British support for everything: military protection, economic investment, political backing. The 1936 treaty gave Britain the right to station forces in Egypt indefinitely, and British officials advised the Egyptian government on all major policy decisions. Even after World War II ended and nationalist feelings were growing stronger among Egyptians, the government remained tied to London because breaking with Britain meant losing the protection and money that kept Farouk in power. Iraq operated under a similar system. The monarchy that Britain had installed in 1921 relied completely on British military advisors, British weapons, and British political support to stay in power. The 1930 treaty guaranteed British influence over Iraqi foreign policy and gave Britain permanent military bases on Iraqi soil. In 1941, when Prime Minister Rashid Ali tried to reduce British influence and move Iraq toward neutrality, Britain invaded with troops from India and reinstalled a compliant government. The message was clear: Iraqi governments served at Britain's pleasure. Syria and Lebanon had just gained formal independence from France in 1946, but French influence remained strong throughout the late 1940s. French advisors stayed in government ministries, French businesses controlled key industries like tobacco and textiles, and Syrian political leaders maintained close personal connections with Paris. Syria went through several military coups during these years, but none brought pro-Soviet leaders to power. The instability actually pushed Syrian governments to seek Western support for security. Jordan was the most obvious case of Western control. The entire country was essentially a British creation, carved out after World War I as a reward to the Hashemite family for supporting Britain against the Ottoman Empire. The Jordanian military, known as the Arab Legion, was commanded by a British officer named John Glubb until 1956. British weapons equipped the entire force, and Britain paid subsidies that covered most of Jordan's government budget. Saudi Arabia, though never colonized by Europeans, was building its crucial economic relationship with the United States through oil. American companies had received concessions to explore Saudi oil fields in the 1930s and struck massive reserves. By 1950, the Arabian-American Oil Company was pumping huge quantities of oil and sharing profits with the Saudi royal family through a 50-50 agreement. This created a direct bond between the Saudis and Washington that made Soviet approaches irrelevant. The Saudi monarchy viewed communism as a threat to both their power and their Islamic kingdom. None of these governments wanted anything to do with Moscow during Stalin's years. They had stable partnerships with Western powers that provided protection, money, and support. Soviet offers would have required abandoning these proven relationships for uncertain benefits from a distant power with no presence in the region. Communist parties did exist in Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, but they were tiny and powerless. Egypt's Communist Party might have had 5,000 members scattered across competing factions that spent more time fighting each other than building a movement. The government regularly arrested communist leaders, and Moscow offered no protection. Syria's party was equally small and fractured, while Iraq's showed slightly more promise among oil workers but still faced constant repression from the monarchy. Stalin gave these parties almost nothing. No weapons, no significant funding, no advisors. Compare this to the massive support Stalin provided to communists in France, Italy, China, and Korea. The Arab parties got ignored because Stalin calculated they would never seize power. Arab populations were too traditional and religious to embrace communism, and investing in these groups would waste resources better spent where communist victory was actually possible. Then Stalin made his one significant move in the Middle East, and it wasn't toward the Arabs. It was supporting Israel's creation. In May 1947, Soviet Ambassador Andrei Gromyko stunned the United Nations by announcing support for a Jewish state in Palestine. This reversed decades of Soviet opposition to Zionism, but Stalin's reasoning was clear. He believed Israel would become socialist because its leaders came from labor movements and talked about building communes. More importantly, creating Israel would force Britain to abandon Palestine, weakening British power across the entire region. The weapons deal that followed was massive and detailed. Czechoslovakia, operating under Stalin's direct orders, became Israel's lifeline during its war for survival. In January 1948, representatives from the Jewish Agency met Czech officials in Prague to negotiate the first contract. The agreement covered 50,000 rifles, 6,000 machine guns, and 90 million bullets. The total cost was roughly $22 million, equivalent to about $250 million in today's money. For a new nation with almost no budget, this was an enormous expense, but Israel had no choice. The aircraft proved even more important than the rifles. In April and May 1948, Czechoslovakia sold 25 Messerschmitt fighters to Israel. These were German planes left over from World War II that the Czechs had kept in storage and refurbished. Czech military instructors trained Israeli pilots how to fly these aircraft in crash courses that lasted weeks rather than months. Later that year, Czechoslovakia delivered another 56 Spitfire fighters. By early 1949, about 200 Israeli military specialists had been trained in Czechoslovakia, including 82 pilots who formed the core of Israel's new air force. Without these Czech-delivered aircraft, Israel would have had no air force at all during the crucial first year of fighting. Getting these weapons from Czechoslovakia to the Middle East required elaborate smuggling operations. The mission was codenamed Operation Balak, and it involved roughly 100 transport flights over several months. The weapons couldn't be shipped directly because international rules and Western pressure forbade arms deliveries to the region. Instead, weapons had to move secretly through multiple countries. The route went down the Danube River, through Hungary, then through Yugoslavia, then through Italy, and finally by ship or aircraft to Tel Aviv. Poland initially refused to let weapons transit their territory, forcing the Czechs to find creative alternative routes. Every step required either Soviet pressure on Eastern European governments or Soviet permission to violate the arms embargo that Western powers had imposed. These weapons arrived at exactly the moment Israel needed them most. On May 15, 1948, the day after Israel declared independence, 7 Arab armies invaded simultaneously: Egypt from the south, Jordan from the east, Syria from the north, Lebanon from the northwest, and Iraqi forces from the east. Israel's army, called the Haganah, faced desperate shortages of weapons, ammunition, ammunition, trained soldiers, and equipment. The Czech rifles and machine guns arrived just in time to equip new units being formed to defend against the invasion. Israeli leaders later admitted the timing was critical. David Ben-Gurion said years afterward that the Czechoslovak weapons absolutely saved Israel from defeat, while Golda Meir wrote in her memoirs that without these Soviet bloc weapons, she didn't know if Israel could have survived past June 1948. Arab governments watched all this and drew the obvious conclusion: the Soviet Union was their enemy. When Moscow voted for creating Israel at the UN and then provided the weapons that helped Israel defeat Arab armies, Arab leaders saw Stalin as hostile to Arab interests. Egypt's King Farouk and his government stayed firmly pro-British. Syria's leaders kept their distance from Moscow despite some nationalist rhetoric against the West. Iraq remained completely aligned with Britain, and Jordan never considered approaching the Soviets. Stalin's decision to support Israel had destroyed whatever small possibility existed for Soviet influence in Arab capitals, and he showed no interest in trying to repair the damage. But Stalin's calculation about Israel also failed completely. When Golda Meir arrived in Moscow as Israel's first ambassador in September 1948, the reaction from Soviet Jews shocked Stalin and his security services. Tens of thousands gathered outside the Moscow synagogue to greet her. Estimates suggest over 50,000 people showed up. They chanted in Hebrew, sang Jewish songs, and celebrated the Jewish state openly in the streets of Moscow. This was unprecedented in Soviet history. Stalin viewed this outpouring as evidence that Soviet Jews might feel loyalty to a foreign nation rather than to the Soviet Union, which he saw as a fundamental security threat that couldn't be tolerated. The problem got worse in 1949 when Israel held its first real parliamentary elections. Stalin had hoped that pro-Soviet parties would do well, maybe even win. Instead, the most pro-Soviet party, called Mapam, got only a small percentage of vote. The winner was David Ben-Gurion's moderate Labour Party, which wanted friendly relations with both East and West rather than becoming a Soviet satellite. Israeli voters made it clear they appreciated Soviet help during the war, but had no intention of letting Moscow control their foreign policy. The final break came in June 1950 when the Korean War started. The UN Security Council voted to condemn North Korea's invasion of South Korea. Israel voted yes, siding with the United States against the Soviet position. For Stalin, this was proof that his entire strategy had failed. He had armed Israel, given it diplomatic support, and made enemies of the entire Arab world. Israel had repaid him by aligning with Washington. From 1949 through 1953, Stalin launched severe campaigns against Soviet Jews, treating them as potential traitors. The 1952 Doctors' Plot saw Jewish physicians accused of plotting to murder Soviet leaders. Many historians believe Stalin was planning mass deportations before his death in March 1953. Relations with Israel broke off completely in February 1953. But Stalin never turned toward the Arabs to replace his failed Israeli policy. He simply gave up on the region entirely. What explains Stalin's total lack of interest in Arab countries? The answer lies in how he understood political movements and power. Stalin had spent his entire career, from the 1920s through the 1950s, crushing nationalist movements inside the Soviet Union. Ukrainian nationalism had been brutally suppressed through forced famine in the 1930s. Baltic independence movements in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were destroyed through mass deportations after 1940. Central Asian resistance was crushed through military force. To Stalin, nationalism represented a threat to communist control that had to be eliminated, not a political force that could be harnessed or allied with. Arab nationalism looked to Stalin like the same dangerous force he had been fighting inside Soviet borders for decades. The Arab nationalist movement talked about Arab unity, Islamic identity, and independence from colonial powers, none of which had anything to do with communist ideology or workers' movement. Their leaders were military officers, wealthy landowners, or traditional tribal chiefs, not factory workers or Communist Party members. Stalin couldn't see how movements like this could ever serve Soviet interests, so he dismissed them entirely. Stalin also made a critical strategic miscalculation about where Soviet power could be effectively projected. He focused obsessively on regions where the Red Army had physical presence and control. Eastern Europe was held by Soviet troops after 1945, which made political dominance achievable through military backing. Stalin could install communist governments in Poland or Hungary because Soviet divisions were stationed there to enforce Moscow's will. China, despite being far from Moscow, had a genuine mass communist movement led by Mao Zedong that had fought a civil war for decades. Stalin could work with Chinese communists because they shared his ideology and had proven they could win without Soviet troops occupying their country. But the Arab world had neither of these advantages from Stalin's perspective. No Soviet troops were stationed in Egypt, Syria, or Iraq. No Arab communist parties had more than a few thousand members or any realistic realistic chance of seizing power. Arab governments were aligned with Western powers that could provide immediate military support if threatened. Trying to build Soviet influence in this environment, Stalin calculated, would require massive investments of money, weapons, and political attention with very low probability of success. He had limited resources and faced serious challenges in Europe and Asia where success seemed much more achievable. The Arab world simply didn't make the priority list. The Soviet intelligence presence in Arab countries remained minimal during Stalin's years. Small stations existed in places like Egypt and Syria, but their job was watching Soviet citizens abroad, not building relationships with Arab leaders. Compare this to Eastern Europe. Thousands of Soviet advisors worked with local governments, or to China, where Soviet aid flowed steadily. The Middle East received almost no attention. When Stalin died in March 1953, he left behind no framework for working with the Arab world. His successors had to build those relationships from scratch, and they took a completely different approach. Now you might be wondering, why didn't Stalin just switch to supporting the Arabs after Israel didn't work out? Simple. Arab nationalism didn't fit his communist framework, so he couldn't work with them. He just gave up on the entire region. The man who eventually emerged as Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, understood what Stalin had missed. Nationalist movements could become Soviet allies even if they weren't communist. Khrushchev created the concept of progressive regimes, governments that opposed Western power regardless of their internal politics. This broke completely from Stalin's rigid thinking, which demanded ideological purity before offering support. The turning point came in 1955 with an arms deal to Egypt that would have been impossible under Stalin. Gamal Abdel Nasser had seized power in Egypt in 1952 through a military coup that overthrew King Farouk. Nasser wanted modern weapons to build up his military and reduce Egypt's dependence on Britain. He approached the United States first, but Washington refused to sell advanced arms without demanding Egypt join Western defense pacts and accept conditions Nasser viewed as surrendering Egyptian independence. Khrushchev saw an opportunity Stalin would have missed. In September 1955, he authorized Czechoslovakia to sell Egypt a large quantity of Soviet weapons, including tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The deal came with minimal political conditions: no requirement to join Soviet alliances, no demand to allow Soviet bases, no insistence that Egypt become communist. The West was shocked. For the first time, a major Arab country had turned to Moscow for military support, and the Soviet Union had delivered without trying to control the recipient's internal politics. The 1956 Suez Crisis turned this opening into a strategic breakthrough. In July 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, taking it from British and French control. Britain, France, and Israel responded in October by invading Egypt in a coordinated attack. The Soviet Union, which would have stayed neutral under Stalin, instead threatened military intervention. Khrushchev's government warned it would use all means necessary to defend Egypt, including rocket attacks on London and Paris if the invasion didn't stop. The threat, combined with American pressure on Britain and France to withdraw, forced the invaders to back down. The crisis transformed the Soviet Union's image across the Arab world overnight. Moscow appeared as the defender of Arab independence against Western imperialism and Israeli aggression, exactly the role Stalin had refused to play. Nasser became a hero throughout the Arab world, and his Soviet weapons and Soviet diplomatic backing became the model other Arab leaders wanted to copy. Through the late 1950s and 1960s, Soviet influence exploded across the Arab world. Syria received Soviet weapons after coups brought nationalists to power. Iraq's 1958 revolution overthrew the pro-British monarchy, and the new government turned to Moscow. Algeria's fight for independence from France got Soviet support. By the 1967 war, when Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, Soviet weapons equipped all the Arab armies. But this entire transformation happened after Stalin died. Every major arms deal, every alliance with Arab leaders, every confrontation with the West over Middle Eastern issues occurred under Khrushchev, not Stalin. The pattern that defined Soviet-Arab relations for decades began in 1955, 2 years after Stalin's death. The irony is striking. Stalin helped create Israel, armed it, and gave it legitimacy at the UN. His successors spent the next 4 decades trying to destroy that same state by arming its Arab enemies. The Soviet Union sold Egypt, Syria, and Iraq billions of dollars worth of tanks, aircraft, and missiles. They trained Arab officers and sent advisors to serve with Arab armies. During the 1973 war, the Soviets conducted a massive airlift to resupply Arab forces. All of this would have been impossible to imagine during Stalin's lifetime. Stalin's rigid communist thinking, his focus on Eastern Europe, his support for Israel, and his basic misunderstanding of nationalist movements combined to ensure he never built relationships with Arab leaders. When he died, the Soviet Union had almost no presence in the Arab world beyond small intelligence stations and ignored communist parties. Arab governments stayed aligned with the West. Arab populations viewed the Soviet Union with suspicion, and Soviet policy consisted of little more than supporting Israel until that relationship collapsed. The lesson is clear. Ideology without flexibility accomplishes nothing. Khrushchev succeeded where Stalin failed because he worked with leaders he disagreed with ideologically, as long as they opposed Western influence. He could support Nasser even though Nasser imprisoned Egyptian communists. He could arm Syria even though Syrian leaders rejected Marxism. Stalin couldn't make that leap. His worldview was built on rigid categories: communist or enemy, progressive or reactionary. Arab nationalism fell into the enemy category, so he ignored it. This inflexibility, which had helped him consolidate power inside the Soviet Union through force and purges, became a fatal weakness in foreign policy, where success required working with imperfect partners. For decades after Stalin's death, Soviet leaders struggled with the results of his early choices. The weapons Moscow gave to Israel in 1948 helped establish a powerful military that became the foundation of Israeli defense capabilities. When Soviet-armed Arab states went to war with Israel in 1956, 1967, 1973, they were fighting against a country whose early survival had depended on Soviet weapons. The irony was impossible to miss. Stalin had saved Israel, and his successors spent billions trying to defeat it. The relationships with Arab leaders that developed under Khrushchev and later under Leonid Brezhnev remained fundamentally unstable because they were based on weapons deals rather than shared ideology or values. Arab leaders took Soviet weapons but didn't become communist. They accepted Soviet aid but didn't give Moscow control over their policies. Egypt demonstrated this perfectly. After receiving billions in Soviet military equipment through the 1950s and 1960s, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat expelled Soviet advisors in 1972 and then made peace with Israel in 1979, completely abandoning his Soviet patron. The weapons hadn't bought loyalty, just temporary cooperation. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it had spent 4 decades deeply involved in Arab politics, arming governments, training military officers, providing economic aid, and competing with the United States for influence. But none of that involvement happened during Stalin's lifetime. Between 1945 and 1953, he looked at the Arab world and saw nothing worth the effort. No communist parties strong enough to seize power, no movements that fit his rigid ideological categories, and no strategic value that justified moving resources away from Europe or China. His calculation was wrong on every count, but he never lived long enough to see how badly he had misread the region's importance. The Arab world remained the one major region where Stalin never even tried to build influence, and that failure shaped Soviet foreign policy for decades after he was gone. His successors had to start from scratch, building relationships without any foundation, making up for lost time, and competing against Western powers that had decades of established presence. The Soviet Union eventually became a major player in the Middle East, but it happened in spite of Stalin's approach, not because of it.